The events of 1857, when thousands of peasants and soldiers revolted against the East India Company, were profoundly influential to India's freedom fighters. It still appears as the first war of independence in school textbooks. But there's much more to 1857. As we will see, it was the last great hurrah of North India's military labour market, which was nearly 400 years old. The revolution also involved the collapse of a peasant system that was even older, and the cultivators and troops were confronted and failed by a post-Mughal landed gentry with a worldview at once modern and disastrously out of date. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, historian and author of Lords of the Deccan. Welcome to Thinking Medieval, where every week we tell you something new about our complex, innovative past. Always feel free to check out our research and citations below, and remember that we're all figuring out how to think about our messy, bloody, dazzling history. As early as 1000 CE and possibly before, immigrant mercenaries made up significant proportions of armies deployed by South Asian states. For example, the lords of Anuradhapura and Sri Lanka used mercenaries from present-day Karnataka, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. The Chola army had regiments such as the Kannadaka Kaduttalai and Malayan Oraichevagar, the Karnataka Strongheads and Malayali infantry. The Rashtrakuta kings had access to contingents from Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Bihar and possibly Nepal, and even Mahmud of Ghazni had troops and officers from Punjab, Haryana and as far away as Karnataka. More in this video here. Now, in his magisterial work, Naukar, Rajput and Sepoy, the ethnohistory of the military labour market in Hindustan, 1450 to 1850, historian Dirk H.A. Kolff explored one thread of South Asia's labour market, the military men called Purbiyas from the Purab region, corresponding to present-day eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. In the 15th century, the Jaunpur Sultanate, which once ruled the region, collapsed, leaving its peasants unable to find employment as warriors. Military service was very important to peasants. As Kolff puts it, was part of a survival kit that guaranteed them access to liquid cash, which their families used to maintain their ownership of land. Young men from peasant families would go off to serve in wars, sending their incomes home. And when they reach middle age, they'll return to their villages to work on the farms, have children, and continue the cycle. Now, the solution that emerged was pretty impressive. Taking up service with various military entrepreneurs from landed families, warriors would accept the temporary identity of Afghan or Purbiya Rajput, irrespective of their birth status, and fight in distant battlefields such as Gujarat and Malwa. Now, military labor was a seller's market, comprising armed men who chose the conditions of employment. They abandoned employers who could not deliver salaries or victories. It was victories and good finances that granted Sher Shah Suri access to military labor, which in turn enabled him to defeat the Mughal ruler Humayun. Now, when the Mughal state was firmly established by Akbar, a more regular system was set up. Military labor was directly recruited by the state and its officers, especially jemadars, who were older peasant warriors capable of bringing with them dozens of young recruits. When Mughal power declined in the 18th century, jamadars and warriors from Purab, now called Baksariyas or Baksaris, smoothly transitioned to working for Nawabs and then for the East India Company or EIC. Jamadars dominated recruitment for the EIC in Bengal, generally hiring their own kin. The EIC, meanwhile, transformed North India by annexing royal courts, drying up military employment, and by disarming peasants, drying up military labor. Now, what was left was an EIC Bengal Army, mostly of men from Purab, who gradually transformed from their high military status into high caste status. By 1842, the Bengal Army had 28,000 men claiming to be Rajputs and 25,000 men claiming to be Brahmins. In 1851, Brigadier General John Jacob noted on recruitment, and I quote, "By this system, man is not to be chosen on account of his fitness to be a soldier, his willingness and strength, docility and courage, but because he is a twice-born worshipper of Vishnu." He also reported a case where a low-caste man was fired once his status was discovered by other soldiers. But the dynamics of military labor were not the same across South Asia. The EIC's Bombay Army had more eclectic recruits with a large proportion of Dalit Mahars. It retained the old tradition of inclusive quote-unquote military caste status that overrode caste by birth. As historian Philip Constable writes in The Marginalization of a Dalit Martial Race in late 19th and early 20th century Western India, even the Dalit social reformer Jyotirao Phule sang of these Dalit military men as Kshatriyas resisting orthodoxy and invasion in his book Chhatrapati Shivaji Raje Bhonsle Yancha. This was in stark contrast to the situation in the Baksariya-dominated Bengal Army, where Kshatriya invariably meant upper caste. And in 1806, as historian Manu S. Pillai writes, caste pride became a flashpoint in the Vellore Mutiny, which involved regiments of the Madras Native Infantry. Now, disarmament was one change brought by the ESC to the Gangetic countryside. Another, far more dangerous, was tax farming. As historian Rudrangshu Mukherjee writes in The Year of Blood, Essays of the Revolt of 1857, this reduced much of the Mughal and post-Mughal zamindar class and brought in speculators such as bankers and merchants from the city into the countryside. Peasant cultivators were beggared and turned into renters in their own land, and many of them had relatives who worked in the Bengal Army. The North Indian peasants and soldiers of 1857 revolted in resentment for what was being done to their economic system, just as much as their caste status. The latter was exemplified by rumors about animal fat in cartridges, forcible conversion to Christianity, and so on. As Mukherjee notes, a major target for their wrath were baniyas, merchants, bank and tax buildings and record rooms, moneylenders, and so on. But there's also hints of something more. Historian Sabyasachi Dasgupta argues in The Rebel Army in 1857 at the vanguard of the War of Independence or a tyranny of arms, that the Bengal Army Sepoy saw themselves as a new ruling class of sorts, not entirely peasant, not entirely zamindar. Taking decisions collectively, seeing their status as superior and confident in their military skill, they might have sought a form of military dictatorship with the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II as a puppet. Their plans were pretty short-sighted and focused primarily on loot and status. As a result, the Sepoys did not have widespread support. The Azamgarh proclamation, made in 1857 by a grandson of Bahadur Shah II, referred to the rebellion Sepoys as plunderers. It asked merchants, artisans, officials, and zamindars to rally for the cause of restoring a loose Mughal sovereignty. Merchants were promised government-owned trains for goods. Officers who faced discrimination under the EIC or lost employment due to the company's dismantling of minor courts were offered dignity and status. Artisans were promised employment by courts. But though this was a more comprehensive plan than that of the Sepoys, these were faint and sorry promises. They had missed the profound transformations of the industrialized 19th century global economy. Merchants and capitalists had much more to gain by being part of British power, and almost half of all zamindars, terrified of revolting peasants and Sepoys, lent support to the British. Finally, the EIC's Indian officials overwhelmingly supported its modernity despite facing racism. They, like merchants, had developed a taste for global advancements in education, economy, and science. And finally, the Bombay and Madras armies had little in common with the upper caste Bengal Army and did not share its grievances. So, without a clear coalition of interests, the 1857 revolt was doomed, and the British wreaked horrific vengeance upon the perpetrators and on innocents across North India. But neither the military labor of South Asia nor its intelligentsia were crushed. Although recruitment from the ancient Purab region was finally halted after 400 years, in subsequent decades, South Asians emerged as the backbone of British power throughout much of the world. Soldiers from Punjab fought everywhere from China to Africa to Europe. British educated officials and their families set up the intellectual foundations of 20th century nationalism, including the rewriting of 1857 as a national struggle. But all of these would create what 1857 did not have, a coalition of interests that stretched the length and breadth of South Asia across caste, class, and sect, bringing our ancestors together to fight for a republic that respected and represented the rights of all citizens, not just a few. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and at Connected Histories and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.